Welcome to the historic Ocean House, a luxurious hotel that pays homage to New England's golden age of hospitality. With timeless elegance and renewed civility, this treasured resort is the setting for our special broadcast of the Ocean House Author Series. Each program features nationally best-selling and award-winning authors in a salon-style conversation, hosted by Ocean House owner, actress, and best-selling author Deborah Goodrich Royce. WCRI is pleased to partner with the Ocean House to present this ongoing series, which brings you the best and the brightest of the literary world. Now, let's take you to the Ocean House.
Dara Levan is the creator and host of Every Soul Has a Story, a podcast in which she interviews inspiring people from around the globe. Actively involved in her community, she is currently a board member of the Community Foundation of Broward and the Joe DiMaggio Children's Hospital Foundation / Memorial Hospital Foundation. She is also a founding member of the Circle of Friends for the Alvin Sherman Library Research, Information, and Technology Center at Nova Southeastern University. Dara is a member of the Women's Fiction Writers Association, Women's National Book Association, and the Authors Guild. And her featured book tonight is It Could Be Worse. Susannah Marren is the author of Between the Tides, A Palm Beach Wife, and A Palm Beach Scandal, and the pen name for Susan Shapiro Brash, who has written more than a dozen nonfiction books, including Tripping the Prom Queen, You're Grounded Forever, But First Let's Go Shopping, and A Passion for More, Affairs That Make or Break Us. For over 20 years, she taught gender studies in the writing department at Marymount Manhattan College, and has guest taught creative nonfiction at the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence College, and her featured book tonight is Maribelle's Shadow. Laura Zigman is the author of Separation Anxiety, Animal Husbandry, Dating Big Bird, Her, and Piece of Work. She has been a contributor to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and was a recipient of the Yaddo Residency. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and her featured book tonight is Small World. Welcome to our authors. Tonight's esteemed authors will be in conversation with Deborah Goodrich Royce. Deborah's thrillers examine puzzles of identity. Reef Road was a national bestseller and was named one of the best books of 2023 by Kirkus Reviews, and was an Indie Next pick by the American Booksellers Association. Ruby Falls won the Zibby Award for Best Plot Twist, and Finding Mrs. Ford was hailed by Forbes, Book Riot, and Good Morning America's Best Of lists. With fellow authors Luann Rice and Amy Sheeb, she is currently creating the Deer Mountain Writers Retreat in the Catskills. Deborah writes a quarterly column for Hey Roadie magazine, sharing her book recommendations and news with the Ocean State. She began as an actress on All My Children and in multiple films before transitioning to the role of story editor at Miramax Films, developing Emma and early versions of Chicago and A Wrinkle in Time. With her husband Chuck, Deborah has restored the Avon Theater, Ocean House Hotel, Deer Mountain Inn, United Theater, Martin House Books, and numerous Main Street revitalization projects in both Rhode Island and the Catskills. After the panel discussion tonight, we will open it up to some questions. So if you raise your hand, I'll walk around with the microphone so that we can capture it for the future folks listening on the radio. And without any further ado, please join me in welcoming tonight's authors.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, everyone. I have had more fun reading these books. Each and every one of these books is about family, and I personally am in a very deep family situation right now. My mother died 7 weeks ago, so I'm kind of deep into that for all that it entails. So I really can't thank you enough for being here, and I can't stress enough how meaningful all of your books have been for me. So, and I think they will be for you too, and I strongly suggest that you buy the extra 2 books that are not on your voucher for your discount. That said, I'm going to go one by one in any order. I always like to start with the author's description of what, in this case, her book is about. You know, it can be the elevator pitch or a little longer than that. So why don't we start with you, Susan?
So Maribelle's Shadow takes place in Palm Beach, which was very important to me because as a gender professor and having written nonfiction books, I was always looking for how women feel emotionally, no matter how disparate they were. You know, so I always interviewed a diverse group of women. But in Palm Beach, where I've spent much of my life because my parents were residents for years, I was always intrigued by 2 aspects. One was why ageism against women doesn't seem such a big deal there, and the women always feel like they have voice, which is impressive and curious. And I also wondered how in a capitalistic culture, women could still have secrets and families could still have such turmoil when really you have everything you need in a material world, and it's so beautiful, and the women are so coiffed. So that being said, I took 3 adult sisters, Maribelle, and her sister Caroline, and her younger sister Raleigh, and their mother, who is quite a trick. And of course, there I was thinking about the idea that you don't always have to have a likable character to admire her. And the mother is so socially ambitious, and everything's fine, except within the first 12 pages of this novel, Maribel's supposedly perfect husband, young husband, not even 40, dies unexpectedly. And then what are the secrets? And what really do we do to be loyal? And what is loyalty in families?
I'm going to insert a favorite quotation there, apropos of what you just said. It is often attributed to Carl Hiaasen as having said about Florida. In fact, it was not. It was Somerset Maugham who said it about the French Riviera in the 1920s. It's a sunny place for shady people.
Wonderful. Perfect. Thank you.
So, which is a perfect segue to you, Dara.
Hello. Thank you for being here. My novel is set in Miami. I'm a Miami native, a rarity. You might not meet many of us, so here I am. And I want to explore how narcissism can manifest in families, how it can tear them apart, looking behind a mask and breaking a cycle of multi-generational abuse. But ultimately, and in fiction, I read copious novels to research. I interviewed several psychologists. I have my own experience with a narcissist. Any of you have any of that? You're all nodding. So I have realized rather rapidly that it's quite a universal theme, but so is unconditional love. And that is the bottom line and the premise of this story. Love it with siblings, love with friends, love with family. And basically, this story is about Allegra Gill. She's the main character. She suspects that her charmed life just might be a gilded cage. And she discovers a shocking letter in her childhood home that basically unravels everything she thought she knew about the 2 people who raised her. So it's a story of acceptance and awakening, but not necessarily forgiveness, that really tells us we can choose how our own stories end. I will add one more thing, because, and I'm glad you brought this up, about loyalty. I also explored, and this happens with a lot of narcissistic relationships, I learned, is dysfunctional loyalty. And what that means is you, no matter what, are loyal to your spouse, to your sibling, to a coworker, to, I mean, we can go on with all the different ways this can manifest. And how can that really harm us when really we just think we're being good people by standing by someone even though they're hurting us? So that's something else I explored in the novel, as well as bringing in my background. I was a speech language pathologist before I went back to full-time writing, and my character stutters, but only with her father. So,
Laura.
Oh, it's my turn.
Yes.
I was so engrossed. Thank you for having us, and it's so great to meet all of you and have you here. Small World is about 2 divorced, childless sisters who move in together as adults. One sister lives in Cambridge. She's recently divorced, and her sister, who had moved away from the East Coast 30 years prior, is now also divorced. And she calls her sister Joyce in Cambridge and says, you know, I think I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back east. And Joyce, who lives in Cambridge, says, you know, well, if you're not, you know, if you don't have any place to live yet, why don't you move in with me till you get settled? And of course, 10 months later, Joyce is wondering why her sister is still living with her. And so I decided to write about sisters because I have a sister. And it started as a darkly comic story, as most of my books do. We were living in Cambridge in a house, in an apartment, and we had these great neighbors upstairs, meaning we never knew they were there. And then they left, and these new people moved in, and all of a sudden there was all this noise, and we didn't understand what the noise, it wasn't that kind of noise, but it was noise, or like regular noise, just people coming and going, and it turned out they had started a business above our heads, and it was a yoga studio, it wasn't a drug business, but it was just a yoga studio. So people were sort of coming and going all the time, and it was the source of real stress between, you know, it was pre-COVID, but we were always home because I worked at home, my husband worked at home, and my son lived there. So we were like very disturbed by the fact that there was an illegal business above our heads. So at first I thought, oh, this will be a great place to start a novel. I love to be deeply annoyed, and so, but I had just written a book about couples, and so I had just written Separation Anxiety, which was about a couple who couldn't afford to get divorced and they had to stay together. And I was like, you know what? I just don't want to write about couples anymore. So I thought, ooh, wouldn't it be funny, haha, if my sister moved back east and moved in with me? We both have kids, but still. So that's how it started. But the deeper part of the book, I realized once I started it, was that these two sisters, as they deal with the annoying people upstairs, start to understand their relationship and the family they came from, which was a family where they had a middle sister who had died. And it's partially based on my family's story. I had an older sister who died when she was 7, I was 3, and my other sister was 5. So it was not a personal loss for my sister and me, because we were so young when she died. But I really wanted to explore what it was like to grow up in a family of loss, and when you grow up in the shadow of that kind of grief. So.
Which leads me to something I think we need to go a little deeper on. So much of our culture, our literature, our music, we live right next to Taylor Swift, our cinema really explores romantic relationships and all the ups and downs and in-betweens of romance. In each of your novels, you've put the emphasis squarely on family of origin, really, whether it is siblings, whether it's parents, it's really kind of all of the above with all of your characters. And Laura, why don't we start with you? You began to talk about that a little bit. You just wrote about a couple, and here you're writing about sisters, but it also gets into the missing sister, gets into very much the parents. I had such a feeling for their mother, and I'd love each of you to talk about these relationships that you brought to us so vividly.
That's a great question. I mean, I grew up in, I had my sister who was born with a very rare bone disease, was born in 1958. And because it was a medical condition where her bones didn't produce bone marrow, she ended up living at the institution right outside Boston called Fernald. And so she wasn't living at home. And when she died so young, my parents stayed involved with the families that were, whose children, some of whom were 20 or 30 years old, were still alive. And so they stayed. And so my childhood was sort of spent with all these families. At the time, we called them retarded children. We don't use that term anymore. But those were the people I kind of grew up with. Christmases were spent in the basements of some of these families and with their sons who came home from Fernald for the holidays and were obsessed with Elvis. So I'm very comfortable and very familiar with that kind of world, and not everybody else is. And so when you grow up in a family that lost a child, it's a really interesting thing. For instance, I wrote a Modern Love piece about this, but whenever my father was asked how many children he had, till the day he died in his 80s, a nurse would come in and say, "Mr. Zigman, how many daughters do you have?" And there would be this pause. Mm-hmm. And he would say, "Well, I had 3, but I have 2. And it's funny how those things like imprint on us, because I remember being at my son's Montessori harvest, because we don't call it things, a harvest festival thing. And there was a father next to me, and we were both filming our sons on stage. And I turned to him and I said, "Oh, is he your only child, or do you have other children?" And there was just this pause, and I was like, "Yep, I know that pause." And that's the pause. And so there's certain things, I grew up in a time when activism, there's that whole activism for disability. Mm-hmm. And the person I grew up across the street from, which is who I based the mother in the story on, was a housewife who ended up, very smart, didn't go to college, and she ended up running something called the Charles River Watershed Association in Boston. I mean, she ended up in the Senate. She was just one of those people who just was an accidental activist, but that's what people were in the 70s. They were like, they saw a cause and they just went at it. And so Louise, who's in the book, Eleanor's mother, is completely fixated on inclusion of Eleanor in every aspect of the family and the world, ironically to the exclusion of the other daughters. So the other daughters end up feeling excluded because her focus is so...
And I will jump in and say, from a personal memory standpoint, I grew up, my parents were very close family friends with another couple who had a son, a good bit older than I, who they would have called retarded at the time. The way they described it is he was at a 4th grade level. Mm-hmm. And I was thrown together with this young man at every holiday, every dinner, every gathering. And I would sit in the basement and listen to him talking about, in his case, Bonanza and Gunsmoke. And I think for me, it taught me tremendous patience. It was actually a good thing, because those were the days parents didn't really worry about you so much. Like, they weren't worried about entertaining me. That was not even an issue. And they were doing adult things. And so that aspect of your book was very resonant for me. I had these visceral memories of Gunsmoke and Bonanza.
Benign neglect. That was sort of the parenting of the 70s.
Which was, I think, kind of okay
Not bad.
in a way. Yeah.
Resilience.
Yeah. So Dara, so we're talking about why families more so than romantic relationships.
So many reasons. That's such a great question. I'm so glad you asked it. I think there's something really special about a sibling bond. And I also think there's something very special about chosen family. So with Allegra, in my novel, she is dysfunctionally loyal to her parents. They have sainted themselves. They can do no wrong. And even though she's a therapist, she doesn't see all the things where she soars, a lot of irony. And so I wanted to explore, where does a safe space for a child? For her, it was her music camp in Michigan. And so we see flashbacks. I wrote the novel in the cadence of a waltz. So anyone that knows music, it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So it's present, present, past, present, present, past. And why? Because as we grow into our family or out of our family, we often become like the people who influence us, who surround us, who raise us, or we go the other way. In Allegra's case, she was a pleaser. So I was also exploring the dichotomy of 2 kids growing up in the same house, and how many of us have that, right? Or night and day from your sibling. And her brother, Jack, really sees very clearly what is and what is not. And Allegra doesn't until she has no choice but to awaken. So I was, in answer to your question, I was really wanting to explore how families, even though seemingly perfect on the outside, there's so much dysfunction, and we all have dysfunction. I mean, if you think you don't, then you're not awake, respectfully. The whole fun and dysfunctional. I mean, it makes for really good writing, I'll tell you, and humor. But you know, at what point is the dysfunction no longer fun, but it's actually harmful? Right? You're feeling that? And I love what you said, because as a speech therapist, that just resonated so deeply with me. There is a lot of kids I used to work with in the autism spectrum and various other, I don't even call them disabilities. I mean, like learning disabled, I call learning differently, for instance. And I really believe that. There's so much onus on the other child to be the perfect child. And that's also something I explored in this novel. Because of the family dynamic, Allegra had to really be perfect to keep the peace. And if she wasn't, in her mind, it could have been her misbelief, her family could unravel. So,
which brings us to you. Yes.
I too am very interested in family systems. And years ago, I had done a study on sisters, a nonfiction book called Sisters Devoted or Divided. And the sisters who were no longer speaking were in search of really good female friends. And the sisters who had a really close relationship with their sisters didn't need so much to have a coterie of female friends. So I thought that was interesting. But in writing this novel, I really looked at my research in terms of the mother. And so Lucinda, this complicated mother in Maribelle's Shadow, she's someone who really plays one daughter against the other. And that's very difficult for all the daughters. I have a pleaser in the middle. Why not? That's a family system. Right. So Caroline, the daughter who's the perfect daughter, she works for the family company. She has 2 daughters. She's raising them in Palm Beach, which is Lucinda's fantasy, coming from the Panhandle. And so this is what she really wants. But she can't reel in the other 2 daughters. And everything would have been fine in this family except for the inciting incident, and that is Samuel's death. So once Samuel dies, Lucinda not only plays the daughters, against each other, but she so favors the daughter who pleases her or fills her fantasy. So I was really looking at how harmful that is for all the daughters, not just the one who gets all the attention and praise, but for the other two who deserve to be respected.
We'll take a short break and be back with the Ocean House Author Series here on WCRI. And we're back with the Ocean House Author Series on WCRI.
Well, continuing from there, what I really found so clearly delineated and so beautifully illustrated, your family, the Barrows family, they are socially climbing. They are going, as you said, from the panhandle of Florida, a very, lower middle class community. They become wealthy in the fast food world, in the food business, and the mother is very socially ambitious and hauls them all to Palm Beach. And for that to work, everybody has to perform at a certain level, and that there's an underlying tension there because they don't all perform at that level. There's the middle girl who does, and I'm wondering if there hadn't been that incident, it probably would have all blown up sooner or later, one way or another, because it's very hard to yoke people into that kind of fantasy.
Yes, and she's very manipulative, and it works for her because of what she wants. But we're really looking at how a family can how it can fall apart because the center doesn't hold, and of course there's so many lies and secrets, and that's another aspect. And then money. I think we have to talk about money. So again, Palm Beach, money. So what does money mean to each of these daughters, and what are they willing to do for it? And then what's reinvention? I did this research on Palm Beach and learned two things. I'm not Pfizer, but anecdotal, qualitative research. As a teacher, a professor, and so not many women on the island, Deborah, actually really work, of all different ages, which is rarefied and really interesting in today's world. So the fact that just one daughter really does what the mother dreams of, and that the other have what we would call in socio-speak pink-collar work, which is a different, but Caroline is really ambitious. So I'm looking at how the mother dealt with that, but what is reinvention for women? And in Palm Beach, that's another thing that my research yielded. There's a lot of reinvention. So when people say about the Barrows family, how did they get their money? Where are they from, really? That's kind of a Palm Beach story. That everyone gets there and has the same goals. And then so many judgments of families and of women judging one another. And that really interested me. Why not more support? And finally, what is survival for a family? Even when you have everything, secretly, deeply embedded in your existence is the question of survival for women, female family.
So let's stick with this concept of a sense of place. I happen to set my novels in real places. I have friends who set their novels in fictitious places. There's no better or worse. You have all chosen very particular places, places you know well, which for me is almost like a character, that sense of place. So Dara, talk about Miami.
Oh, yes, it's interesting. I grew up in Miami, as I said. That, even though I went and retraced steps, like the Venetian Causeway, for instance, because my mind said, oh, maybe that's 395, but it wasn't. So it's the smells, even growing up in my grandmother's kitchen in the 70s, and her making chicken soup. I really tried to put myself not only in the Miami of today, but little girl Dara in Miami, and then trying to make a bridge between those two worlds that I hope comes through in the settings, whether it's iguanas and orchids or the sensory. As a writer, I feel we really want to capture all 5 senses, at least for me. I will sometimes close my eyes and think of how does that smell, not just the action, not just the plot. And so Miami has a certain vibe, and in fact, there's a big thing in Miami called Jubin. I don't know if anyone knows what that is, probably not. So Jewish Cuban. So, I didn't have to do any research because before my husband, sorry honey if you're listening, the 2 men I dated were Jubin. So I had my research done long before the novel. So Benito is Allegra's husband, and I really wanted to pull in a lot of cultural, there are certain things so specific to Miami, like Palm Beach, you described it so beautifully. I know Palm Beach well too, and Miami is so specific, not just tropical, but there is a vibe, there's this amazing fusion and sensory experience in Miami that I feel is like no other. And not just the Latina influence, and Latino, but the texture of Miami, just listening to the rustling of palm trees. It's different than going to California, because I go there frequently as well. And so I love that you said the place as a character, because to me, setting really influences and impacts us as characters, but us as human beings, right? Aren't we much a product of our environment? Going back to what I said earlier, or not? And I think that's a choice. So growing up in Miami is phenomenal, and it's also probably why I'm sometimes late, because we call it Miami time.
Miami time. I like that. So Laura, you have chosen Boston, which you know well, and I don't know Boston that well, but wow, I could see so clearly everything you described, the parks, the walks, and talk a little bit about that. Do you always write Boston? Talk about the sense of place in this novel, and if you vary it from novel to novel.
Yeah, my first novel was called Animal Husbandry, and it was about a woman who gets dumped and tries to figure out male behavior by studying animal behavior. Complete fiction, right? I was never done with that. That's what I did, and it was before Google, and I'm very obsessive with research, and I'm obsessive with my obsessions. So that was set in New York. I mean, that was a very specific time and place. That was I never thought I was going to go to New York. I worked in publishing for 10 years. I met Amy there. It was a very particular time and place, because we didn't really know it at the time, but we weren't getting married as early as some of our friends in other parts of the country, and we were just working and working and working and dating and getting dumped all the time. That's what you did, work and get dumped. So for me, I was like, wow, what is happening? And so I ended up writing Animal Husbandry, and it got sold at a really lucky point. And I was often accused of copying Bridget Jones' Diary, which I thought was really funny, because her book was being published in England. It was before the internet really happened, so I didn't know that. And I remember my friend who was publishing Bridget Jones in the United States said to me beforehand, "Oh, we're publishing this book." And so then I went on my tour, and I was like, "Oh, this book is coming," because I read it. So fun, as if she needed me to pimp for her. But so New York was very much the scene, the dating scene, and all that. And every book since has been set wherever I am. And so the last two books, Separation Anxiety, about the couple, it's also set in Cambridge, and that has more of the, sort of classically funny, People's Republic of Cambridge stuff, because it's a Montessori school and all that. This is different because it is still set in Cambridge, where I live. I live in a really beautiful street. I always have to say I rent, but I live on this gorgeous street in Cambridge, right near Harvard Square. And yet the two sisters, especially Joyce, the sister whose apartment it is, really doesn't like to leave. And so she gets really obsessed with the app, which in the book is called Small World, but in real life is called Next Door. So I don't know if you guys have Next Door. But instead of really going out and interacting with the world around her, she works at home, she scours Next Door and looks at all the posts and the stories and the problems, little problems being solved, and turns them into poetry.
So that is one of my favorite aspects of the book. And it's right here. I wanted to talk about that. So she does that. somebody is bedeviled by a squirrel, or somebody needs an apartment, or lost a bike, or all of these really quotidian things that all of our lives are composed of. And your character, Joyce, takes these things. Her own life is maybe a little bit out of control, and she turns these posts into poems. And in the book, it will just have the little poem about the squirrel or something. And
Turkeys.
it's such a lovely structuring. It isn't really structural. I don't know if you followed a pattern for how you included it, but there's a moment where you just break away. It's thinking of you, Dara, with music, and I'm not a musician, but I know in music there are rests in the music. It's almost like a little rest from the action where you, the reader, can reflect on the squirrel, but you're also thinking about what's going on with the characters. I'd love you to talk a little bit about that.
So, yeah, I would. I wish I could take credit for the brilliant idea of turning Nextdoor posts into poetry, but I can't, and I credit the person who did this on Facebook. But I thought, oh, no, steal that. But and so I became really obsessed with Nextdoor after that, because I was like, oh my God, a gold mine. And as I was writing this, a voyeurism. And as I was writing this book, you know, if any other writers in the room besides us, you know, like the best part of writing is not writing and procrastinating. So anytime I could go down the rabbit hole in Nextdoor and look for like turkeys, you know, or this, whatever, or like bad neighbors, you know, noisy neighbors. So I had file folders on my desktop, you know, and then I would just break them into, I wouldn't change a word, I'd just break them into poems. And the whole point was I didn't know how I was going to use them, but it really turned into one of those like organic things that happens when you write, if you're lucky. This happens. And you're trying to figure it out, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I know. And it's really because Joyce grew up in a family where they couldn't solve the problem. You know, they had a child who died in the fictional version at 10, and their family couldn't solve that problem. And in her kind of like this world, in Small World, she gets to follow all these little problems. You know, who's the best plumber? Where do you get the best pizza? How do you get rid of the turkeys? You know, don't go that way, go the. And she can really see that little problems can get solved, and that's why she does it. But I put them in, and it was funny. It was funny because I used them verbatim from Nextdoor, and I was so proud of myself because what I thought was so great was you didn't have to change a word, and they really were poetry. Try it. I say, go home and try it. And so when I turned the book in and I told my editor, she said, God, I love the poems. And I was like, so do I. And I said, you know what? I didn't change a word. And she's like, I don't think you can do that. So I ended up having to rewrite all of the poems. But I would use one or two lines from each one and then kind of just make it almost the same, but not really. But I found that there were the really funny, normal ones about plumbers and pizza. But then there were these long posts that really were like stories of people, and you know, people are lonely, you know, and they would, you know, some had just lost their husband, they loved walking around Charles River, but they were lonely, and I found it really moving, I found those posts really moving, so I included those too, so.
So one of the things I want you each to talk about is going back to this idea of family, and family as a safe place, or as a place where we're not so sure we feel safe. And what brink can you go up to with a sibling, with a parent? Susan, you mentioned siblings who don't speak anymore. What is the point where people cross that line? One of the things, I have to return to the death of my mother for a minute. My mother died so beautifully that I can't quite get over it. I hope I never get over it. It is something that's just resonating with me every day. My mom was a bit of a scrappy person. Any of you who knew her, she could be a little, she wasn't a shrinking violet. She wasn't kind of going along like a Zen master. I adored her and I was very close with her, but she was a complicated woman. On the other hand, she had this dying day, this last day, where it was like I was in the presence of Mother Teresa. She knew she was going. She spoke with love, reassurance, compassion, talked to the grandkids, talked to my husband. It was like I was getting a window into the essence of a human being. And I was getting a window into the essence of our relationships. Whatever ups, downs we had had along the way, we were suddenly at 36,000 feet with the utmost tenderness, looking at these souls who had played it out in the years that we played it out. And it was really extraordinary. So I want to go back to your books. So reading these books on the heels of that was really powerful, because you, each one of you, in different settings, you explore that safety, that these people, whatever goes on with them, I sensed ultimately as safety. So we're going to start with you again, Susan, and talk a little bit about this.
In terms of safety? Well, actually,
or however you want to talk about it.
Well, actually, in my novel, no one's safe anymore. And everything is really a facade, and it's very hierarchical, and they're in a very hierarchical town. So there's so many stratas, and there are so many ways to be accepted, and as it unravels, with Lucinda really in charge of it, every daughter is really put to the test. And the price of belonging becomes so steep, Deborah, and it's so hard for them. So what seemed safe, a family, here are the Barrow sisters, they're all beautiful, they're all well married, supposedly, but what are appearances, and what is the truth? And what, of course, one of my favorite themes, what is it that women, that we really long for? Because what becomes apparent in this novel is the longing. And it's the mother's longing really brushing up against her daughter's longing. And then we've talked about sort of dysfunction, and mothers put in these positions where they do the best they can, and we realize it's suboptimal and benign neglect and all of that. But here's a woman who is so micromanaging with the whole system. And again, as I said before, in a town where she's really concerned about how she'll be perceived. And why is that so important to women, and so important to be a certain kind of family? Because that sometimes takes away from what you said, essence, and I know in a very different way, but one's essence can be compromised, as in with my characters, if it's put, to the test and not really honored.
Right.
So that's what I was looking at.
And where do your characters fall on the safety spectrum? The Allegra with her father, for example.
How long do we have, Deb?
Well, I have a few minutes.
Yeah, though there's a lot of body shaming. I didn't go there yet, but
Right.
So she feels unsafe in her body. She feels unsafe in her parents' home, but even as an adult. And what happens for her, her reckoning, her awakening, which I believe the radiance emerges from our breaking points. I think we all have breaking points, and we can either go to the dark, or we can be like a glow stick and break and then shine, right? So for Allegra, she doesn't realize she doesn't feel safe. That's what is a big quandary for her. So she doesn't realize until she becomes a mother herself that there's a different way to love and be loved, and that the way in which she loved and was loved wasn't healthy. So in terms of safety, as the book progresses, and after she discovers the secret about her father, I mean, it's her hero. He's a pediatric neurosurgeon. He fixes people's brains. I mean, he's just this. Her mother is a headmaster at a school. Two impeccable, upstanding. Again, a lot of similarities. Our themes, breaking down facades and what does something really look like. And so her safe space was camp. And her grandparents die, and I have the chills, I'll tell you later, but I had a very similar experience you had with your mother, with my grandmother. Wow. I actually was with her as she passed, and it's exquisite, and I pulled some of those emotions, and I'll never forget that. It was such an honor and a privilege to be there. And she left the planet the way she came in, on her terms. And so I pulled in those emotions in writing these characters. I thought about my grandmother, actually my husband's grandmother, but like a mother to me, and my own grandparents, who I haven't seen in 20, 30 years, I pulled in all those emotions. They were her safety. So safety doesn't always just come from mom and dad. Safety can also come from a best friend. And Allegra has his best friend, Ruby. We see them as kids in camp, and we see them as mothers. So we go back and forth. So her safety comes from everywhere but her family of origin.
Right. Laura, what would you like to say on that subject?
I love hearing all your answers. So for me, what I was really trying to express and explain was what it felt like in my family, which was, it was just a quiet, sad place, you know. And I would go to other people's houses, and I lived in Newton, Mass, and we lived at the bottom of West Newton Hill, and up on the top of the hill, most of my friends lived, and they had these huge, it was the 70s, so huge Victorian houses with rice paper, you know, lanterns and plants and, you know, and every, bless you, and every house was full of kids and noise and sports, and you know, you'd come over there and it'd be messy, and there'd be animals and pets, and you know, skis and lacrosse sticks and everything, and you. I would go over and have just like have a sleepover, and you'd have fun, and then it was time to go home. And it, you know, there were much worse homes to go home to, but there was just this quiet dread about going home, because it was like you'd come home and it was like this total deflation. It was like, because it was a very, you know, we didn't really interact. I mean, we did, but you know, if something happened, we just went to our spaces, like my father went here. And so it was that kind of house where you just didn't feel like, you didn't come home and feel like, wow, you know, I'm loved. And I was loved, but it just didn't feel that way.
Right.
And so I was really trying to express what that was like, and what these two sisters, you know, when you grow up that way, we talk about like, you know, I'm so interested in people's families. I'm always, I met this reporter last year from WGBH in Boston, and she said, we had a drink, and she said, you know, I'm a journalist, so I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. And I was like, you know what, I'm not a journalist, I'm going to ask you more questions. And I did, because I'm always, I just want to know. But the minute you find, you know, with these two sisters, you know, they grew up in this really weird way. And so they don't know how to communicate with each other, and probably also with their husbands, from whom they're now divorced. Because also, when you are grow up in a family of sadness, you can't even, you don't want to ask for anything. So it's called well child syndrome. I'm sure you're familiar. But it's called there's a name for it now, called well child syndrome, where the well children are just, you can't need anything. So I started waitressing when I was 14, and I just didn't want to ask my parents for anything. I mean, I could have, but I just didn't want to, because it was sort of like, you had problems, you were like, I can't go to them. They already have problems, you know. And so I really wanted to explain what that was like. And these two sisters finally come together, you know, sort of in midlife, and work through that in a funny, dark way.
We'll take a short break and be back with the Ocean House Author Series here on WCRI. And we're back with the Ocean House Author Series on WCRI.
I think we're going to open it up to questions now. I am sure you all have. Wait for the microphone to come around, because this will be on the radio. And Lou Ann Rice, the author herself, has a question.
It's more like comments. This was so wonderful. I moved to tears. It was so beautiful, all of you. And just each, I mean, I'm riveted by your stories. And I relate to, you know, so many things. And I'm sure everyone will, but I'm an oldest of 3 sisters. Narcissist, yeah.
Check,
you know,
check.
Cha-ching, cha-ching, all of it. And, you know, and just thank you for being so open. And just, you know, it's very sad, some of what you've said, but it's also like, it's funny. I mean, I think that's what sometimes we feel when we have a tragic family. You know, and I just want to also thank Deborah for what you said about your mother. I did know your mother, and I just know that you've been through so much in the last 7 weeks, and thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
So anyway, here. Anyway, thank you. Before I cry.
So while we're waiting for the next one, family dysfunction story on my end. When I was 11 or 12, I was outside playing with my cousin Vincent. Now this is a guy I haven't seen. He calls himself Wayne now. Hello, Vincent. Hello, Wayne. I spoke to him yesterday, not having spoken for 40 years.
Oh.
But he was the one who told me I must have done something particularly obnoxious. He said, yeah, well, you have a brother you don't know about. I said, I do not. Guess what?
No. No.
Yeah. It was a fascinating story. Yeah, it was.
And it stopped there.
My father was 36 years older than my mother, and he had had a child by his first marriage. He had put his first 2 wives in mental hospitals. They were cousins of each other, the first 2 wives. And
Like a novel.
when my dad married my mother, and this massive age difference, his son, who was married with 3 children, and they had a very nice, upstanding life. He was in advertising. They were scandalized. They thought, well, this just doesn't fly. And they severed ties. And in the grand old tradition, my parents thought, well, let's just not mention. We're just not going to mention.
It's a minor detail.
But all my dear friends here, probably you've met Bill Goodrich. He's my nephew. He's older than I am. I've become very close. Well, the brother died before I met him. I'm super close with his kids. Yeah, so there's been a healing. But family. Questions? Amy?
Thank you all. Having been in publishing a long time, I know it's very important to be sitting in the audience thinking of your question, because there's nothing a panel likes more than to freewheel on a question. And I worked with Laura back in the day in Knopf when she was a publicist, and she would say to me, if you're at the reading, come with a question, so that the authors aren't just sitting there like, what do I? So my question that I've been thinking about as you're talking is, as writers, which was your favorite character in your novel and why?
Susan?
So I've been asked that a lot, or who do I identify with the most?
Now, who's your favorite?
Favorite.
Different, yeah.
Okay, so I would say Raleigh, the youngest sister, whose feet don't even touch the ground, because she doesn't really play by the rules, and she does some, well, I don't want to give the book, no spoiler here, I don't want to give it away, but what she does is reprehensible, but we forgive her. I hope you forgive her.
We do. I'll say as a reader.
Oh, thank
you do.
Thank you, Deborah. Okay,
Yeah.
there you have it. But writing her, I really loved her. And I loved how she defied her mother and how she tried to break with this newfound tradition that was supposed to really matter more than anything. So she was my favorite.
Only one?
Just
Yes,
one.
your most favorite.
Unquestionably then, Jack. It's Allegra's brother. He sees and says what is. He is bold. He is unapologetically who he is. He may or may not be sent away because of who he is. And he becomes a really important character, although obviously a minor character. Going back to music, there's minor and major. He does become a major influence on Allegra and her realizing her truths. And he's hilarious. He swears like a sailor, but also has very intellectual multisyllabic words. And so I loved writing. He's so all of the characters, hopefully, you hope, are multifaceted and have lots of layers, or they're quite boring, if not, in my opinion. But Jack is a hoot. I mean, he's just, I miss him, actually.
Laura?
I think it would be Lydia, the older sister who moves back from California, because she's a little, she's a blurter. You know, she's a little they're both antisocial, but she's kind of like odd, more than a little odd. And her oddness just comes out, you know, in that she'll blurt something or just say something or make people uncomfortable, and you never know really if she's doing it on purpose. Usually not. She's just one of those people. And I just had a lot of fun writing it because I'm usually trying to be really careful about what I say. It was fun to just be like, oh, if I weren't, I would just say what Lydia just said. So, and it keeps the it always made it an interesting scene to write, because I hate when writers talk about it. I never quite knew what was going to come out, but I often did not know what was going to come out of Lydia's mouth. And she would say something, and then it was so fun to just write whatever that conversation was going to be.
And her sister reveals that throughout her life, she has written to the parents sorry notes for things when she's blurted or created a scene. And it's funny, I found a sorry note from one of my daughters in recent years, and it was so just heart-piercing to me that the situation had led her to feel such regret and to apologize to me as a little girl. And parenting is rough.
And endless.
Endless. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
When you work with these characters, you start off thinking they're going to do whatever. Do they branch off and kind of become their own? Does it end much different than you anticipated?
So a lot of the times I have the beginning of a story or a situation, and I think, okay, here's the story of the situation. And then I call it getting the plane up in the air. And then I'm writing, and then I have this panic, like the plane's in the air, and I have to land the plane. So for half the book, I'm stressed out the entire time I'm writing. I'm also stressed when I'm not writing. I'm never happy. But when I'm trying to figure out like where is this going, it's always this really stressful thing, because I wish I were the kind of writer, maybe you guys are, where you know where you're going. I had no idea where I was going in Small World, and I was like, I'm going to figure this out. And luckily, I feel like I did, and it felt like a really solid, because you set up questions. For instance, the sister moves in, and then she doesn't move out. And you have to ask yourself, why is she there 10 months later? Because the reader's going to be like, well, can't she just move out? Yeah, it's hard to get an apartment, but and so there has to be a reason. And so, I won't give it away, but there is a reason, and it folds back into the story of who they are. And so that was like, oh, thank God, I'm going to land the plane now. So.
Relief.
I can answer an interesting way. So in the writing world, there's what's called plotters, people all my thriller writers, I'm sure you do this, or I'm not sure, but most of my thriller writer friends are so meticulous. They've told me, because you can't kill someone without introducing the character. Then there's pantsers, fly by the seat of your pants. Woo! I think I'm like a plantser. So I'm somewhere in between. I didn't quite outline, but I knew my beginning, middle, end. That never changed. But the scenes. So for instance, these really spicy scenes are in there. I definitely didn't write those, because when I left the desk and I came back, I said, who, what? So I promise, yes, your characters can take over, because, oof. I don't know.
I heard a journalist phrased it very well. Instead of plotter and pantser, he asked me, do you chart your books with a map or a compass?
Oh.
And I chart with a compass. So I have a sense of where I'm going, but not a complete map.
Yeah.
Well, because I come from the nonfiction world where you outline to get a book contract, I would say that I spend weeks creating the character. For instance, I know that Lucinda in Maribelle's Shadow still goes to Costco for ketchup, but it's not in the book. But I understand her character, even though she's very fancy now. And I always know the beginning and I know the end, and I'm stumped and hysterical about getting there. Because every chapter, as we know, has to be riveting and move the story forward. I've written chapters where my editor said, I'm sorry, why is that in there? And I say, because, and she's like, no, it's not strong enough, it's not interesting enough. So it has to have a lot of tension and friction always.
I'm so glad you're all stressed out too.
Yeah, it's stressful.
They were really fun to live with.
I think we have time for one more question before you, Camilla.
Yeah, hi, this is sort of more on a practical level. I'm curious, how long did it take each of you to write your book? And what approaches do you use to discipline yourself, or to really get in the saddle every day or every couple of days? Just what's your style of writing and manifesting these books?
So for me, this one, Small World, took about 4 months because I was late with the contract and I needed to get paid. And I always have found that that was the motivating factor. But all joking aside, I have gone years without writing. In fact, I had a 10-year period of writer's block where I just couldn't write. A lot was going on at home, a lot in life, a lot of stuff, and I just stopped writing and I started to ghostwrite because I couldn't write my own stuff. But when I'm finally writing something and I don't have a job, I mean, animal husbandry I wrote on my vacations so it took me like 5 years to write that book, which is not the ideal way to write a book because you change in those 5 years. But I wrote it in the summers for 5 years in a row, so it took a very long time. And all the other books take really a few months, probably 4. This one took 4 months.
My answer is interesting. I wrote my initial draft in about 14 weeks. And in terms of discipline, I said I'm sitting down, and it's very hard for me to, I do so much outward. So I learned so much about myself having to go inward. I'm clearly not that introverted. So for me to zip it and not answer phone calls and not go to meetings was so difficult. But the challenge was I wrote it in third person, even though the whole time, and I love that you use the word manifest, because my gut, my intuition kept saying, this should be first, and then I rewrote the entire thing in first person. And you would think that's just changing a few pronouns. Not so much.
No.
So I gave myself a mini MFA. That's how this book happened.
Well, I'd like to say that Maribelle's Shadow was written in first person, all 3 sisters, because it alternates chapters. And the publisher asked me to rewrite it in third person.
I'm so sorry.
Well, it's not just changing I to, she. I agree with you completely. So
Yeah, and I tend to, it generally takes me about a year to write a draft. I don't know why, and then it takes me a good year of revisions. I have a draft of a book, and I had charted out my days meticulously to do my revisions. And day 1 was the day my mother got sick. And I showed up at the hospital with that computer on my lap. And as my mother was talking to me, I was like, Mom. And after a few days, I thought, Deborah, shut the laptop. So that's, life comes along.
Right.
It just comes along. Yeah.
And I would say that certain books take longer than others. Like my second Palm Beach novel, A Palm Beach Scandal, I zipped through it. I couldn't even believe that I was the one writing it. It moved so smoothly. And other books have really been tougher, really much more. And Deborah, I want to say that my father died in November. And I really have not been able to be on my schedule either. And it's very tough. It's very different. So.
Well, I want to thank you all so much for coming tonight, and all of you.
Thank you for joining us for this special broadcast of the Ocean House Authors Series with Deborah Goodrich Royce. Please tune in each month as we'll bring you a new Ocean House Authors Series highlighting nationally best-selling and award-winning authors in a salon-style conversation. Hosted by Ocean House owner, actress, and best-selling author Deborah Goodrich Royce. The WCRI is pleased to be partnering with the Ocean House to bring you this ongoing series highlighting the best and the brightest of the literary world. Thank you once again for joining us. And in the words of Margaret Atwood, in the end, we all become stories.